Welcome to Rubber Bellissimo at the Movies. This is a YouTube video podcast where we explore all things cinema. I want to welcome to the show Robert Dance, who is a writer. He is the author of The Savvy Sphinx, How Garbo Conquered Hollywood, Hollywood Icons and Glamour of the Gods, and co-author of Garbo, Portraits from Her Private Collection, and Ruth Harriet Louise and Hollywood Glamour Photography. And we're going to be discussing his latest book today, Joan Crawford, Ferocious Ambition, Joan Crawford's March to Stardom. Robert, welcome. Thanks so much for being here.
Good to be here.
I love this cover. I must say that just before recording, I mentioned to Robert that through another podcaster I know, Kendall Kruver, as soon as I saw this image, I know Crawford, obviously, but I was so sucked in. And I was like, I've got to get this book. So was it your decision to use this image for the cover, or was it?
I'm happy to say the designer at the press chose it, but he certainly picked a fantastic image.
Yeah.
So much of Crawford is about image and the still image. And
yes,
she developed that herself, and it's a fantastic cover.
Oh, I completely agree. And all the images are wonderful, which we'll get into. But before we jumped into the book, I was curious, do you remember the first film with Joan Crawford that you ever saw was?
Yeah, it was Grand Hotel many years ago. And before there was really the sort of revival that we've got now, before we had Turner Classic Movies and all, the great classic films were shown. I remember even back in college, and Grand Hotel, of course, is one of the most important of all of the early films. And there she was. And it was interesting because I knew about Garbo, and I certainly knew the name Crawford, but it was amazing, even the first time I saw her, how she held up in that film as an equal partner to the great Garbo.
Mm. Were you an instant fan, or did it take seeing a few other films?
Well, I've always respected Crawford, and I guess I would say I was always a fan. I was Camp Garbo, as you mentioned. I've done 2 books on Garbo. And it wasn't until the gauntlet was thrown down for me to write this book that I watched every film she made in order. I mean, that was the way I decided to do it. And given the world we live in today, you can pretty much do that. So I watched them all, including the ones I'd seen before. But of course, I hadn't seen the early silents, because about a third of all Crawford's films are silent movies that are not much shown today. So I wanted to see, how this career developed. And I just was completely wowed at how she was developed, how extraordinary she became. And then the fact that she could sustain it, for 5 years, maybe the record.
Yeah, no, it's extraordinary. And, with all, I know you talked about this in the book, but for people listening who haven't read it yet, with all the books on Crawford, that there are a number of books on Joan, why do another one? What did you want to tackle that was different?
Well, I think it's always authors think that they've got the truth, the right story to tell. And I think with Crawford that was particularly true. She wrote 2 autobiographies, which I think are excellent. Alexander Walker, about 40 years ago, was the first person who had access to the MGM archives, and he did a very good book. But a whole series of books have come out, over the last 40 years that pretty much repeat the same old stories. And I was frustrated because I thought there had to be a different story. So I wanted to find out what it was. And if it was interesting, I would write it. And I hope I did.
Oh, you certainly did. I mean, I found myself glued to it. And I like that you also, even though, you were focusing a lot about her career and how her career changed and how she was really good with business and studying everything about movies and cinematography and acting, how much of a professional she was there. You did include, biographical aspects. And I was curious, how did you go about choosing what to include about her life mixed with everything about her career?
It's interesting the way you asked that question, because the book has been well received, I'm grateful to say, but on a few occasions, I have been taken to task for not having it enough about biography.
Oh, wow.
He said, that really wasn't the point of the book. As you said, you have to tell the story, the story of the husbands. She started out in abject poverty. That's part of it. But my interest is how did this completely untrained woman, really still a girl, get herself to Hollywood? She wasn't particularly attractive. She was overweight. She couldn't act. She really couldn't dance. Become the most thrilling star of the 1930s and carry it forward. That became the story that I wanted to share, because that was the story that had never been told before. Many books about her had gone from film to film to film, sort of done a Crawford biography based on content of films, narrative. And I wanted to write about what it was behind the films, how did, was each film made? Because Hollywood is only about money. You're only as good as you're then and now. So if she hadn't been successful, she wouldn't have been given another chance moving forward. I don't think MGM ever had any intent that Joan Crawford was going to be a star. And then it sort of just happened. And then when she became a star, she didn't become a star the way MGM intended her to be a star. And then she became, a supernova. And I thought, how does this happen? Not enough to say that these things happened, but what made it happen? How much of it was deliberate, from her point of view? How much of it was studio's point of view? How much of it was just chance? And it turns out virtually none of it was chance. This was, Crawford, she understood the system and worked it to her favor for her whole life.
Well, one thing that really stood out to me was how important these portraits were back then. So I just want to show some people some of the photos. So this is such a gorgeous shot, such an incredible shot. So this is 33. And what I find so extraordinary is that if you look at photos of her 2 or 3 years before, she looks completely different. I mean, to me, she doesn't, but you can sometimes have a hard time figuring out that it's her. This is just 2 years earlier. Now, would you happen to know, was changing her looks through wardrobe, makeup, hair, was any of that intentional, or was it just sort of, her face, naturally maturing from maybe, in her being there in the 20s, being like 19, 20 when she started, moving into her 30s, but she often looked so different in such a short span of time. So I don't know if you would happen to know how much of that was calculated.
Yeah, I would say 100%. So she starts when she is 19. She gets herself to Hollywood. As I said, she was attractive, but not movie star attractive. She's a little overweight. She starts getting put into, very small roles. Her first role, she's a double for Norma Shearer. And she wants to learn the business. And she learns very quickly, watching Marion Davies, Norma Shearer. She's saying, all right, these women are very successful. What do they have? And one of the things that they had was a real collection of portraits. So she made herself available to all of the portrait artists that were working. She made herself available to the lighting technician. She learned about lighting. She learned about makeup. This is on her own.
Right.
She became everybody's best friend because she was that kind of a woman. She was naturally likable and she was interested. And she was as interested in the people who worked, the costume designers, the lighting technicians, because, of course, she had virtually no access, to the stars at that point. So she would go into Clarence Bull's studio. It was Bull who did that photograph. And she would ask, what does it take? How do lights work? And it turned out she had a beautiful face for photography. And, she had to diet. I mean, she's not the first young woman to go to Hollywood and learn, if I lose 15 pounds, the planes of my face become revealed.
Right.
What was interesting about her early years that ties directly into portrait photography is MGM knew that she was doing a good job. So she was in minor films. She got better parts in lesser films. And she always recorded well. But she was, at best, never going to be a second lead. So she was in cowboy pictures. And then they would put her with Lon Chaney, and then she would do, a minor romance. But then they would co-star her with Ramon Navarro. So when she's working with Chaney and Navarro, she's got the great portrait photographers. Otherwise, she gets the B and C team. but she's always learning. She's studying her own pictures, and she's watching her face evolve as she becomes a better subject. By 1929, when MGM is about ready to reveal her as a star, she's the dancing girl who doesn't really dance very well. Also, at the moment that we're having the transition into talkies, but she's about pep and vitality, and she's got this very pretty quality. She's worked it out. But of course, as you just showed, within 1, 2, 3 years, she gave up that guise altogether and became the glamour goddess of all time.
Mm.
She lost more weight, and it's the I call it the three-legged stool with Adrian designing clothes for her, George Hurrell, who's starts photographing her in the early 30s, and then she gets Clark Gable as her leading man, and that's it. But it's really working with Hurrell that turns her into the face of the century.
What was it about these portraits that were so important back then? Was it mainly because of the fan magazines, and that was a big marketing? Was that a big marketing tactic, or why these photos were so important?
Yeah, I mean, the goal was always to be on the cover of Photoplay, be on the cover of Screenland, become on the cover of Motion Pictures, and all of those painted covers were taken from photographs. So
right,
you were a star when you were on the cover of Motion Picture Magazine, when you were on the cover of Photoplay. And of course, as I said, Hurrell portraits. Also inside, they would have a full pages of the stars. The public was ravenous for these magazines, and the magazines are what kept the stars in the audience's mind between pictures. So we're dumping photographs and hoping that the editors, would pick particularly the people who were up and comers. I'm pretty sure I can say that. The number 2 most included in magazines in the 30s was Crawford. Number 1 is Garbo. Garbo just doesn't really matter what matrix you want to do. Garbo comes up first. She didn't work on it at all. Crawford got to know the writers. She wanted articles about her. She was available for interviews. She was available for photographs. She scrutinized the pictures very carefully. She looked at them. She wasn't that she looked at a picture and said, you can't use this. If she saw a picture and didn't want to use it, she'd say, let's take it again. It wasn't about killing pictures. It was about getting a better picture. That kind of, today you think, okay, I'm killing all the photos you can use too. Well, if that happened to Crawford, she'd say, I'll be by tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. We'll start all over again.
Oh, wow. Wow. No, it's so incredible. And, we touched on some personal details about her life, but one thing you wrote about was that she, men with money appealed to her. Do you know why specifically that was something that appealed to her?
I think it had to do with her background, and I think it had to do with her father abandoned her mother when she was a child. We're not even sure they were ever married. She had a brother by the same father. He's out of the picture very early. Her mother, we're talking about now 1910, 1915, when uneducated women with children had very little opportunity. So if she wasn't being taken care of by a man, this is her mother, who was going to pay the bills? And her mother had very, very poor taste in men. The easiest thing to say is she took up with a lot of creeps. Who abused Crawford in a whole variety of different ways. There was one after the other. Her mother, for a time between boyfriends, lived above a laundry. She was doing laundry, and they lived upstairs above the laundry. This is a terrible way for a kid to grow up. So Crawford, like a lot of other people, got out as fast as she could. She wanted her mark, and she wanted to have a more comfortable life, and she saw that the path in this period, was to take up with men. Or she bettered the men by becoming a successful professional in her own right.
Right.
But she knew that, starting with Mr. Schubert, who she met in Detroit, who's the one who brought her to New York, or meeting, Mr. Raff from MGM in New York, who brought her to Los Angeles. And that was the name of the game. She picked the right fellows, and all of them liked her. That was the other amazing thing about the Crawford story, is is that, often you have relationships with people and you leave them and there's a lot of animosity. Crawford and Harry Raff were friends till the end of his life.
Oh, wow.
She kept sending him notes, the back and forth. So,
Huh.
it was a very peculiar kind of relationship that she had with the men in her lives. She didn't want to let anybody go.
Right. And one thing that really I thought was interesting, one of the many things, is that when we think of the kind of characters she played, which of course, as you well know, back then, movie stars, they were often molded into certain types that the audience would then know what to expect. And I know in her case, that sort of changed over the years. But you talked about how the Joan Crawford, that the personality was basically a creation, like it is for a lot of the stars back then. But it seems to me that a lot of those qualities that we saw in the films, being, independent, driven, strong, ambitious, tough, it seemed to me that that was something she strongly identified with in her own life. So how much of what we saw on the screen was that type that she played, and how much of it was really from her own personality, or is that hard to say?
And I think it's pretty easy to explain. She was given the name Joan Crawford at MGM 6 months after she got there. Harry Raff had a contest. I don't know of another performer who had a national contest to choose a name, who became successful, anything like Crawford. So she was born Lucille Lesueur. Growing up, she was called Billy Casson. Casson was the name of one of the stepfathers who passed through. MGM didn't like either Lucille or Billy or Casson or, they wanted a new name for her. So it was a contest. The winning name was Joan Arden. For a variety of reasons, it was changed to Joan Crawford. So all of a sudden, Crawford had an entirely new identity that she could fill any way she wanted. And she decided to fill it with a very elegant persona that was as you said, the smart, the savvy young woman who perseveres against any obstacle. And by the time she became a star in the 30s, all of her films were the same. And she wasn't happy playing the girl from the wrong side of the tracks who, through one story or another, and then one guy or another meets Clark Gable, in a tuxedo, so she gets an evening gown and they're happily ever after. Except these stories were working and fans were lining up, and she became one of the highest paid professionals in motion pictures. So it really wasn't until the late 30s, when the glamour era was beginning to wane, that she started fussing around for more dramatic roles. But I'm not sure that either she, and certainly not the producers at MGM, thought that she was a dramatic actress. After all, they had Greta Garbo and Norma Shearer, who were doing different films every time. Crawford was doing the same film every time. So it wasn't until maybe The Women in 1939, when she started doing these more interesting films that MGM realized that, my goodness, she can act.
Right.
And but they still were these independent women, but all of a sudden they had much more texture and more interesting. And that, of course, continued when she went to Warner Brothers and then was an independent in the 50s. There was always that sense of the woman up against it who perseveres because of intelligence. Her films about intelligence, and can overcome obstacles. And it's what her fans wanted. It's just that the last 20, the 40s and 50s are her great years after she left MGM. They were much more textured characters than they had been those women in evening gowns, Big Romance by Robert Taylor, Robert Montgomery, Abel. They were pretty much all cut out of the same.
It's interesting that it took until, like you said, the late 30s for them to see how good of an actor she could be or was. Because when I just recently for the first time saw Rain, and I thought she was really good in that, and that was a pretty daring part back then. So I'm surprised it took so long for them to sort of catch on. Do you think that's because Rain didn't do very well at the time?
Well, Rain was a flop and Crawford hated it. It took a
Right.
generation's eyes to look at it. I think it's a masterpiece.
Yeah, it's very good. Really good.
She's so, what we would say today, over the top. The makeup, the costumes, the
Yeah.
acting, except it's perfect.
Yes.
Just perfect. And I think it seemed, a little off kilter. And folks, there were plenty of critics who thought it was terrific, but for the most part, not. And so she avoided those sorts of roles, until
Right.
really the women. Strange Cargo, was another fantastic movie where she was playing against type. Again with Gable, A Woman's Face, where she played a woman who was physically handicapped. These are very different kinds of roles.
Right.
So it also had to do with, as I said, the glamour era ended. The careers of Garbo and Shearer were changing. They were leaving the studio. Their careers were certainly changing. And then Mayer, did the unthinkable. He hired Greer Garson. That became the real galvanizing moment for Crawford, because Greer Garson got the good parts.
Right.
Crawford really, really wanted, Mrs. Miniver, Random Harvest. And, so that was in a way what provoked Crawford to leave the studio.
Who would you say were some of the collaborators that contributed a lot to the kind of part she played and her image on screen?
Well, as I said a minute ago, her career was transformed when Adrian came to MGM, because for some reason, she became his muse. Similarly, Harrell at the same moment. So nobody wore Adrian's clothes as well as Crawford. Nobody looked as good in a photograph by Harrell as Crawford. Nobody was a better leading lady with Clark Gable than Crawford, So this really fixed it. But then when we get to the end of the 30s, you can't count on first of all, she's an older actress. She's leaving her 30s, but she's a much better, performer than she was before. And, ultimately, I think it was Jack Warner, who, by signing her up at Warner Brothers, put her into an entirely different environment where it wasn't a glamour studio the way MGM was. Of course, it's the home of Betty Davis. It was known for much tougher writing, which Crawford was ready for. And she worked with a variety of producers at Warner Brothers. When you think of the films that she made between 45 and the early 50s, Mildred Pierce, Possessed, Huberesque, Flamingo Road, The Damned Don't Cry. I mean, no other performer, had hits like this, boom, 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 and she got the nominations behind it. So, this is working with a series of very clever producers who understand her, not her glamorous persona, but her dramatic, aptitude. And I forget which of the films, but one of these from the early 40s, the studio head said, keep away from the close-up. She's too old. And the director said, she looks great. Oh, yeah. No, over 40. We don't want women in close-up who are over 40. And, that became, this wasn't about Crawford. This was about the whole industry.
Right.
Do a close-up, we want it to be of Gene Tierney. We're not looking for a 40-year-old Crawford, even though, as I said, she still looked wonderful. But she was up against. So she really had to shine as a dramatic actress, because she'd been known for her beauty. She'd been known for her glamour. And now she had to be known for her acting ability. And that's what she did. And it's a fantastic story.
And remind me, so she often told people she was born in 1908, but it was actually 1904. Is that right?
I believe it's 1905. It's
1905. Okay.
She stuck to 1908, looking at census records and all. But I'm pretty sure 1905 has got to be the year. No birth certificate has survived. There are those who apparently you didn't have to register births in Texas in 1905. I wouldn't be surprised if she didn't send somebody early in her career to Texas to pull the birth certificate and destroy it. I mean, that would be very much, Crawford would just remove any evidence because, and it all had to do with marrying Douglas Fairbanks Jr., He was
Right.
11 years younger, and he was, I think, 19 when they got married, and she just, didn't want to be perceived as a cougar.
Right. Right. Well, one thing that you certainly see even in their films, the men, her leading men, when she was in her 40s, were often, a lot of them were often like 10 years younger, if not more. But you could never tell. Yeah. Those guys, like, you look at Sudden Fear, for example, Jack Palance was something like, what, 15 years or so younger? And
he wasn't a glamour boy, so it didn't become, and he's supposed to be a bit younger, but he doesn't look as much younger that he was actually, because she's an older woman who takes up with, and then of course gets taken by this younger man, and right. That's part of the dramatic tension, because she's older and a bit vulnerable.
Yes, right.
What's going on, and then then she becomes Joan Crawford. That's
right.
That's the great drama of Sudden Fear. Is at the moment of realization what's going on, she fully rises to the occasion. It's a fantastic. I mean, in some ways, it may be her very best film.
Well, I just saw it recently for the first time, and her performance in it is so extraordinary, and it's incredible how much she can do when she doesn't have any dialogue. Like, for example, when she has the gun and she has decided to kill Jack Palance for planning to kill her, this affair that she's found out about with him and Gloria Graham. And then exactly what she's thinking and feeling as she looks in the mirror and sees the gun, and what if, I can't do this, and I can't kill someone. She doesn't need any dialogue. You know exactly what she's experiencing, what she's thinking. And then I saw just after that Our Dancing Daughters, which the silent film. And of course, I couldn't help but wonder, she must have learned so much about how to use her face to convey what she's thinking and feeling, because naturally, that being a silent film, that's all you have is your reactions. And in that film, she's always, she was which is common in the silent period, is often the actors are maybe a little more broad or a little over the top, but I found she never was. She was very real. If she's crying, the tears were real. It always seems like she never felt the need to go bigger, at least in that film. So I can't help but wonder if she learned a lot about acting, through just really behaving and thinking what the character's thinking and feeling what the character's feeling. I don't know. Is there any indication or as to things that she specifically picked up on as an actor? I mean, I know she didn't formally study, or was it really just on the job by job, she picked up something?
She had the good fortune to come to MGM with no background whatsoever, including stage. So she learned acting, which was, of course, silent, on the spot. And
right.
She went from the smaller to bigger and bigger. And because she wanted to do a good job, you're exactly right. She never became a broad actress.
Right.
It wasn't like Clara Bow, she's often compared to, even though she was about youth and in films like A Dancing Daughter, she managed to underplay, and some smart director taught her to let the camera always come to her. She didn't have to force it. And by the time you get, now almost 25 years later to Sudden Fear, that great scene where she's in the closet, the door opens, the reflections in the mirror. There are, I think, a couple of minutes with no dialogue.
Right.
And it's the camera and Crawford and shadows. It's all, this is film noir, the shadows. And as you say, she tells the whole story of I'm here to kill him, but can I kill him? Can I pull the trigger? All with the subtlest facial movements.
Yeah.
And these are what a silent film, a top silent film star learns. And she conveyed it as successfully as if they've been having a dialogue. And, that she was such a pro. And she remembered those tricks. And, having the perfect face for the camera, beautiful lighting, the beautiful direction, and was it glorious once? And they don't need dialogue; they just have the faces. And there was a perfect
Right.
example, and it's the same year virtually as Sunset Boulevard. So
Yes.
it's the proof of what Glorious Swanson is talking about can still happen.
Well, it is one thing I picked up on because I watched Mildred Pierce again recently, and I hadn't seen it in a while. And having seen it so close to Sudden Fear, the stories resemble one another. I don't know if that was something that they thought, let's try to recycle it to an extent like they did before when she was always caught between two men, which was like her type earlier. I don't know if anyone would happen. Was that something that ever came up in any of your research?
Well, it's not something that one can really research because this is kind of sub rosa. But what do you do with a female performer who is 45, still looks fantastic, and you want to put them in a romance? You're not 20 anymore, so you don't have this first blush of youth. So it almost always has to be some sort of midlife romantic change. So of course that's what's happening in Mildred Pierce. Certainly is happening in The Damned Don't Cry. She leaves her husband, gets involved with a gangster. She hadn't been married before in Sudden Fear, but this is a midlife romance. It certainly happens in nearly all the films, in the 50s.
Yeah.
You mentioned Autumn Leaves.
Yes.
It's what you have to do with a romantic star who's 45.
Right.
And so Katharine Hepburn does Summertime, more or less the same period. A woman who never had a relationship before falls in love in Venice. That works. But it's more interesting, I think, these change in life relationships. You're off with the old, on with the new. And in the case of Mildred Pierce, at the last frame, she's back with the husband. Whether or not that'll work or not work. But I think it's part of there's only a limited number of stories.
I see.
Crawford from 45 to 60s, they're almost all variations on the theme. And
right.
As you get younger, that becomes part of the story. Autumn Leaves is about a woman having a relationship with a man 20 years younger. Who is 20 years younger? I mean, that's the point.
Right.
So it's how do you invigorate your life in middle age? And you're right. It becomes something of a motif, but they're all different.
Yes.
Unless you really diagram the story quite superficially.
I'm actually surprised that Autumn Leaves is not discussed more because I believe it was on the Criterion Channel when the Criterion Channel first started. I think that's when I discovered it. And then I saw it again recently, and I think that is such a good movie. Really extraordinary film. So I am surprised it's not something people talk about more. I was curious, how do you feel about that film?
And the films you made just before, Female on the Beach. They're both, Female on the Beach, she's a very successful woman who takes up with a beachcomber who may or may not be trying to kill her, and that's a different story. In Autumn Leaves, she's a middle-class woman and falls in love with a fellow who has some, emotional handicaps. But
right.
in both cases, I believe every word of it, and especially, living in the 21st century, it's not uncommon today, for older women to have relationships with younger men. I think it was very unusual at the period.
Right.
And it was something that Crawford was able to give her fans, particularly women in the 50s, in that post-war era where women were at home having children, cooking, living very conventional lives. And each of these films with Crawford, there's just something a little, sort of overly sophisticated, So dream of women who were 45 or 50, to meet a 30-year-old beachcomber, or in Autumn Leaves, handsome young Cliff Robertson, his as I said, the emotional challenges. But these were very provocative stories, but I think they had resonance with the fans. And
right.
they're perhaps more modern today, or they were very modern then, but they have more resonance today.
I think so. Yeah.
Unbelievable. You know, you watch this and you think, yeah, this all could happen. You know,
Yeah.
it's like Sunset Boulevard. I mean, you know, there's a story that I'm not sure what Billy Wilder had in mind in 1950, but today it's not a peculiar story.
Mm.
It is, you know, this idea of this wealthy, glamorous woman taking a young lover. You know, it happens.
Yes.
You can name 5 female, you know, stars who have an aspect of this. And,
Yes.
you know, so you look at this movie in a very Sunset Boulevard, you look at Autumn Leaves, you look at Female on the Beach, you know, in a different way, because women have a different authority.
Mm. They're almost more relevant now. Even Autumn Leaves with explores mental health,
Yeah.
in which at the time you didn't really see that very much in film, and now obviously there's a lot more awareness for, you know, when I was watching Cliff Robertson again, I was like, well, I'm not an expert on mental health issues, but he looks to me like he has PTSD from everything that happens. Yeah, but they didn't, as you know, they didn't say that in the film or even back then. But now you think
been identified,
right. But I think people would be able to understand it probably better now than at the time. But I really like that one, and you also wrote about Harriet Craig. When you talked about how that sort of resembled her own personality, because the character is so controlling. Another really excellent film that I had never even heard of until I read your book. So these are just some of these ones that slipped through the crack in film history.
Harriet Craig, I'm sorry to say, is a masterpiece.
Really good, yeah.
It's so good because you know, she is so mean and controlling. Destroys everybody around her, you know, but she does it with such style. You don't want to have a friend like Harriet Craig, but it's fun spending an evening with that movie.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. No, I really enjoyed that one. If you had to pick, is there a top 5 for you for Crawford, or is that too hard?
Well, as I said a minute ago, you know, certainly Sudden Fear, you know, is one of the masterpieces. I always put, you know, on the list and ask everybody to watch Grand Hotel, because it's the performance where she notifies the world that she's a major star. And there's a sequence right at the beginning where she and John Barrymore meet on the balcony. It's the time they meet, and they do this physical ballet together as they're getting to know each other, and she's demonstrating that she can play with the absolute top professionals and hold her own. So it's important. I love Strange Cargo, an amazing movie, one of her late MGM films. And then The Damned Don't Cry, I watched over and over again, because, I mean, again, it's just pleasure watching her go through the motions as a gangster's mall, you know, and climbing up the gangland ladder, you know. And then I agree with you, you know, an unheralded film is Autumn Leaves. And then,
yes,
you know, you can never leave Baby Jane off the list.
Of course. Who doesn't know that one, right?
One for the ages. And, you know, it is 2 flawless performances in a flawless, weird film. But, you know, it's just a flawless, weird film.
The end, that scene she has at the end of Grand Hotel that was Lionel Barrymore, right? The man who's dying, right. When he's gonna help her and give her money, and then she says, well, we'll find the best doctor and we'll help you with your I thought, again, just her acting in that scene, just how emotional they got, and it's so touching the way in which they embrace and comfort one another. I mean, wow, she really was, and so modern, her acting right from the start, you know, the start of the talkies, or even in the silent era, like we mentioned with our dancing daughters.
Nancy daughters. The interesting thing about Grand Hotel is in the book, she is perhaps a part-time prostitute.
Yeah.
She's a stenographer prostitute, which had to be cut. So the book reveals her as somebody, who needs to get along in this world, which is not in the movie, but it makes that final scene with Barrymore so much more tender.
Right.
So, that there are the two sides, because he's saying, look, I've got all this money, and she didn't stuff it in her purse. She pushed it back and said, no, we're going to go together. We're going to,
yeah.
And so it's a fantastic scene, but would have been even better if the relationship with Wallace Beery, had been unpacked a little more like it was in the book. But the motion picture code got in the way of
right. That. Right. Yeah, because they only really suggested that from what I took of it, that she was willing to prostitute herself to the guy she was working with. When he kept offering her, to go away with her and hint, and she's like, okay, but they could only go so far with it. But I think it's fairly obvious that to the audiences, I'm sure even then, what they were
really going on. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, what was really going on there. Of course, with Crawford, the elephant in the room is always Moby Dearest, which you also wrote about in the book. Would you say that hurt her at least professional reputation at all, even now? Or
okay, so this is that book came out almost 45 years ago, and it came out at a moment where there weren't podcasts like yours. Thinking about old Hollywood wasn't an academic exercise. It was a turn of classic movies. So I think when Christina Crawford wrote this book, in my opinion, she wanted to tell her story, but I think she thought it would have a very small audience, because after all, celebrity biography was an industry. She didn't know she was going to write a book that would spend a year on the New York Times bestseller list as #1. She didn't know that she was writing a book that was going to change the way child abuse was thought of forever. I mean, this is such an important book that she wrote. And of course, there were two sides when it came out. There were those who said, yes, Crawford was a terrible person. There's plenty of people who said none of these things happened. And it certainly didn't help Crawford's reputation, but I'm not sure there was much reputation one way or another professionally. She was an actress who hadn't made a movie in a long time, had died. Her best work was far behind her. I don't think that many people really thought about it. And when they did think about it, also remember it's the 70s, where spanking children was not that unusual.
Right.
And certainly if you look back in the 40s and 50s. And then what happened, which really, I think, galvanized the whole Crawford thing, was the movie. So, millions of people read the book, and the book has real texture. There's no texture in the movie. The book is written from a child's point of view. Of course, the movie is written from Faye Dunaway's point of view as the crazy movie star. So all of a sudden, it wasn't Joan Crawford anymore. It's Faye Dunaway. She is now the face of Crawford. Faye Dunaway is the face of the story. And for a long time, the drag queens were imitating not Crawford, Faye Dunaway. They weren't quoting lines from the book. They were quoting lines from the movie. So it became completely, and it took about 20 years for that, to go away. But what happened in the meantime is film studies, interest in classic film. The 21st century came. And what happened is Crawford started rising again in spite of Moby Dearest, rising in the affection of a new generation of fans. As I mentioned earlier, I've written 2 books on Garbo. And the first one was her centennial book in 1905. That was a huge book. And there was, Rizzoli did it, and Garbo was still, queen of Hollywood. Well, 15, 20 years later, Garbo's almost completely forgotten. Davis has slipped. Katharine Hepburn, nobody remembers Katharine Hepburn anymore. These women are considered so arch and mannered. Who's the one who's rising in affection? Crawford. There are so many Crawford sites on Instagram. I mean, if that is any.
Yes, I've noticed.
Or go on Google and type in Crawford, it explodes. So the mommy dearest world, has I think accepted where you want to be with it. Nobody wants to be known as an abusive parent. She was an abusive parent. There's no question about it. But she was also one of the greatest screen performers ever. And today, that is her legacy, not being an abusive parent.
Right.
So the last chapter, in which I call Mommy Dearest, I talk about that. These are both realities that you have to deal with. You can't dismiss Crawford as a fantastic screen performer, one of the greatest stars of Hollywood, just because she was an abusive parent.
Right.
Forgive this, because I happen to believe, what Christina wrote. Many people say, she made the whole thing up. Well, it's clear if you read it. Christina Crawford wrote a beautiful book. As I said, saved countless children by bringing this to the attention. But Crawford's career is a monument,
right?
In motion pictures.
Yeah, I noticed there's a whole Facebook group dedicated to claiming that Christina lied. I just thought, how could you?
It's tiresome, because it's obviously she wrote a book. Whatever else it is, it's her story of her childhood, and the stories are real to her, and there's something behind them. If somebody asked you to write about when you were 12 years old, you would have memories. Of course, they're not going to be perfect, but they're going to have to do with the context of your life, as they did with Crawford. So to say, no, everything she said was a lie, it doesn't make any sense.
Right. I agree.
And if you read Mommy Dearest, not watch the movie, if you read the book, there's plenty of nice stories about the relationship of daughter and mother. It's a very nuanced book.
Yeah.
If you pull out, the 12 best stories, they're there.
Right.
And some of them, are really, terrifying. But, she also writes about, living in Hollywood in that period. And, Christina had a horrible childhood. There's no question. I don't think you can simply say that everything she said is right or everything she said is wrong. It has to be, these are children, memories. So it's.
Yeah, I believe she hated the film, Christina. Yeah.
She sold the rights to it. She didn't apparently, did not have any authority for the screenplay. So she simply has to make the film. And I think, naively, she thought it was going to follow the book.
Right.
The script, again, was not told from the child's point of view. It wasn't told from the victim's point of view.
Right.
So the movie became, the whole world was a victim of Joan Crawford, not just her.
Yeah. No, I think that's exactly it. I believe you have something coming out, another book soon. Am I right? Or
Fabulous Faces of Classic Hollywood came out about 2 weeks ago.
Oh, wow.
Largely a picture book. Was released ACC in where are we now? So yeah, the first of July it came out. So find it. It's got Betty Davis on the cover, with plenty of Joan Crawford in it. There's going to be a launch party at the Academy of Motion Pictures coming up.
Oh, wow.
In October, early October. So any of your fans in LA, watch out. I think it's the first Saturday in October. We're doing a party at the Academy.
That's great. Fantastic. Well, I'm looking forward
to be back and we can talk about Fabulous Faces.
Yeah. We should certainly plan that. Is that also going to be University of Mississippi Press, or is that a different?
ACC. This is ACC, which is a British publisher.
Oh, okay.
But this is a glamorous coffee table book.
I see. Well, that's great. Well, I'm looking forward to that. And again, the book, which is a really wonderful read, Ferocious Ambition, Joan Crawford's March to Stardom. Where's the best place for people to get it if they want to get a copy?
Well, I hate to say Amazon, but why not Amazon? In New York, go to Barnes and Noble or LA,
Right.
find books. But yeah.
And I believe you have an Instagram page dedicated to the book as well.
Instagram page dedicated to the book. Yeah.
Great.
Fun to I get to populate it with Crawford pictures every once in a while. So then there's an Instagram page now devoted to Fabulous Faces. So Fabulous Faces.
Oh, great.
So have a look at that as well.
Great. Fantastic. Well, I'll leave the links in the description box below for where you can follow Robert on Instagram. And again, Ferocious Ambition is the title of the book. And if you're a Crawford fan or a classic Hollywood fan, highly, highly recommend it. So, Robert, thanks again for coming on.
Both a lot of fun talking to you.
Thank you so much, everyone, for watching. I want to thank all of my members on Patreon. If you're interested in becoming a member of my Patreon, head over to the link, patreon.com/Robert Bellissimo at the movies for full details. Patreon is exclusive content that I create month in and month out. And as a subscriber, you are able to vote on polls and contribute to what I do on Patreon month in and month out. So head over to the link for full details. You can also leave a donation directly to my YouTube channel by pressing the thanks link, which you will find directly below the video frame. Just click on the thanks link and you can leave a donation there if you choose to. And lastly, if this is your first time here, please consider subscribing. It is absolutely free to do so. By pressing the Robert Bellissimo at the movies logo, you will see it floating above my head in the top left corner. To your top left in just a second, just click on that and then click the bell in order to get a notification every time I release one of my new episodes. Also click the like button and leave a comment below. Let me know what you think of this episode. Also, you can also share the episode. All of these things are what produce traction to my YouTube channel. So I appreciate you watching and thank you again. And I will see you in the next episode.